Well, as Toomas has just reminded me, Estonia is a very punctual country, and so we're going to start on time. I feel as if we've been running a marathon. I was in the Kadriol Park, and there was a real marathon going on, but we've gone through both in terms of geography. We've gone from China to America, Middle East, Black Sea, Western Balkans, other places. And we've also gone through all sorts of different terrain. We've had some spectacular highs. I would particularly commend Lars Fridén for standing up and saying, I am a Western ambassador and I have been to Xinjiang. I think that was the best put down I've ever seen in any conference anywhere. I will remember that all my life. We've had some troughs as well in terms of some people who've taught some pretty ripe nonsense and sometimes even got away with it. Not so many swamps and not so many deserts. But anyway, we are now in the final lap, and I want to thank all of you for staying on for this final session. This is going to be a conversation which will start off as a three-way conversation, but will then later give you a chance to ask your questions or make your points, because we are in a multipolar world here and you're part of it. And the subject, you'll notice, is thinking cannot be a campaign. And this is a very interesting quote, because we are, all of us, thinkers, and you might not realize it, but we are also all campaigners. Everything we do in our personal lives is part of a campaign. You can do things, you choose how you spend your money, where you don't spend your money, you choose where you go on holiday, where you don't go on holiday, you choose what you say on social media, you choose when you vote. We are all individual campaigners, sometimes in very small campaigns and sometimes in very big ones. And we are all also here thinkers. And one of the things that strikes me about this sort of conference is that we're very good about thinking that what other people should do. So those of us who've never run for elected office are very good at giving advice to politicians. Those of us who've never run companies are very good at giving advice to businesses. Those who've never worked for governments are very good about giving advice to government officials about different heroic and career-ending things that they could do that we would make the world better and that we would agree with. Those of us who've never written books are very good at advising other people what they should write books on, I might add. But here we have my two friends, both Toomases. One is a Toomas and the other is Toomas. But Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the former president, who I think literally needs no introduction. Thomas Bagger, who is very well known to all of us in this policy community in his many different roles, but is now here as the diplomatic advisor at the office of the federal president, not because he is here in his personal capacity. In that capacity, he has written, I think, one of the most important articles I've read in recent years.
From Germany.
About the world.
I said from Germany.
It's one of the most important articles I've read. Anyone who's in the world has to worry about Germany's role in the world and its lack of role in the world. And this is explaining, and he'll go into this in a bit more, about how very difficult the post-1989 world is for Germany. We thought that pre-1989 was quite difficult for Germany because they were divided and would be, as Constance Stelzenmüller said in another memorable point, would be turned into a pile of ash within 3 weeks of the war kicking off. But actually, post-1989 is uncomfortable in a different way. So if you haven't read the Washington quarterly article, please log in, pay a few dollars, euros or pounds and get it, or go to your nearest library. I'm going to come to Toomas in a moment, but we're going to kick off with other Toomas, Hendrik Ilves, the centre of a little political row in this country where a newly responsible or newly empowered or newly influential political party actually suggested that he shouldn't be allowed to come into the country because of all the bad things he says and does about Estonia. This is quite unusual. I remember when I first met you in 1990 and you had to come in with a Soviet visa. You're now a citizen of a country, and a country by definition cannot deny entry to its citizens. But we'll get on to the ins and outs of Estonian politics a little bit later. But I want to start off with something you just told me, which I think is really interesting. Because it shows how what we do as individuals is part of a campaign and can have big ripples, which then make other people, put other people in a position of having to respond. So, Toomas, you went recently to a country, and I'll give it its full name, Taiwan, Republic of China. Tell us what happened.
Well, I was invited there to, as often the case where, why I'm invited is to talk about digitization and the kind of principles of the digitization process at a conference that was devoted to digitization. And so I gave my talk there, and then as a professional courtesy, the president of Taiwan, the Republic of China, because I was a former president, invited me for a 45-minute tea, where we discussed digitization. So this ended around 11 o'clock in the Taiwan time, and then about 11 a.m. Tallinn time, the ambassador from the People's Republic of China went to the political director of the foreign ministry to protest my going there. And the political director sent me an email, I said, well, we have no control over him. He's a private citizen, and that's the story.
And I think this exemplifies something that particularly the Leninist regime in China finds so difficult to understand, which is actually a great source of strength for us, that they don't understand that individuals really do have initiative and organizations really are independent. They tend to interpret everything as part of some kind of plot, and they would have seen this as a breach in Estonia's One China policy. And it's a reminder for all of us, we can do stuff. Make a point of seeking out your nearest Taiwanese. I feel almost that Taiwan is the new Estonia. We maybe get onto that at some other point. But Toomas, tell us about your article, maybe a little bit about the thinking that went into it before you published it, and how you feel about the impact that it's had.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on this stage, Madam President, to be here in Tallinn again and with Toomas Ilves. And I was intrigued by the title of this final session, this final conversation. I think what I tried to do was simply to understand why it was that we felt we should lecture the world on the lessons that we had drawn from our own history, and how I had arrived personally at the sense that there was something fundamentally wrong in the way we think about Germany's place in the world, because we took its lessons, the lessons of '89 and of our own history, to be applicable to everyone. But upon closer inspection, I would say a lot of it is actually the result of a very peculiar and very particular history. And we've drawn our own particular lessons from that. I'm not saying those lessons were wrong. I'm just saying they're not as universally applicable, and we'd rather be careful and think for ourselves and not sort of use thinking as a campaign to teach others as much as we were prone to do. And I think when I go back to the title of the overall conference, we have a problem with the future in the West, in Germany. For many years, we believed it was ours. And now we're no longer so sure. And we discover that it's actually far more open than we like, or we would have liked. And I wonder, why is that? And I've come up with two sort of major points about this that I'd like to share. The first is that the world no longer conforms to our expectations. And by ours, I now mean sort of mostly German expectations, but you judge for yourself. The grand convergence hasn't happened, and we've talked about this during the course of the conference, just about China that has taken a different turn, Russia that has taken a different turn, but then also in many of our own societies in the West. So there is an element of disappointment in what I would call exaggerated expectations that we had, or expectations that, at least in hindsight, seem exaggerated. And then there's a second element, and it's a line I owe to Masha Gessen, who was here on the podium as well, but she said it at an event at the American Academy in Berlin, where she said, if you can't imagine the future, you will reach for an imaginary past. And this notion of our difficulty to imagine the future in many of our societies, imagine a future that holds as much promise as the present or as the future we imagined in 1989. I think is one of our major problems. And that's why I look forward to our discussion here, because I think imagining the future, including with all of the technological change, not just the geopolitical change, but the things that happen within our societies at the level of the individual, is really the great challenge we have. And it's one of the greatest one of the strongest indicators of our troubles with the future, that the number of people who believe that their children will not lead a life as good as their parents or as they themselves has been rising in basically all of our societies over the last few years.
And when I was learning German, one of the things I loved was German words that don't exist in other languages. And there's a very good one, which is
many of them.
Zukunftsangst, fear of the future. And I'm wondering, so can you just tease out a little bit, how far of what you're talking about is a particularly German problem, and how far is it is this a problem for all Western societies?
Well, I think, and that's what I also try in the article. I mean, the theme of the end of history is not a German invention, right? So that's been it's been picked up everywhere. It's been popular in many places. My argument was that there are certain elements that make it plausible that this notion was particularly popular and stuck with Germans, and in some ways made our thinking about the world somewhat lazy over the last decades. And these peculiar elements, just to name two of them, was if you think that structural forces shape history and not personal agency, you like that as a German. For a country that has been as badly burned by charismatic leadership as my country, it is perfectly comfortable to believe that the task of politicians really today is to administer the inevitable. But the broad corridor is already defined. That makes it particularly comfortable for Germans, much more so, I would argue, than for Americans or French or others. And the second element is, for a country that's been on the front lines of the Cold War and sort of the most heavily militarized territory globally, to believe that, as Helmut Kohl famously said, for the first time in our history, we're surrounded only by friends, has basically reduced Germany's threat perception to zero. And I know that comes as a puzzle and a riddle to everyone in Estonia and in many other places, but it is part of a very broadly shared perception. And to be very clear, there's not a lot of sympathy for President Putin or for Putin's Russia in Germany. And I think everyone who believes otherwise goes wrong. But there's absolutely no appetite for conflict with Russia, and there's actually not much of a threat perception. Whatever you may think when you live in Poland, when you live in the Baltic states, when you live in Georgia or elsewhere, I think Alex Lambsdorff yesterday put that very well on the podium and in explaining that. And that has to do with sort of collective psychology, but it comes directly out of not of the Zukunftsangst, but of another, it's a great German word, Zuversicht. There was a way to look forward to the world we were moving into. That's the 1989 feeling, Zuversicht. And I think that is exactly what is lacking now, what we're struggling with. What is the story about the future, and particularly for politicians, that they can credibly, compellingly, convincingly offer in an age of not just China's rise or Russia's antagonism, but also the digital age?
We're going to get on to the lack of threat perceptions and the digital questions in the course of the discussion, but I want to come back to you, Toomas, because you actually now hang out in Francis Fukuyama's neck of the woods, or perhaps I want to say he hangs out in your neck of the woods. Anyway, it's the same. Come back on, Toomas.
I'm actually partially a fellow at CDDRL, which is his and Larry Diamond's shop there. Well, it's curious because I think, the concept of the end of history as understood in Germany, which is that boom, over, is really especially bizarre because actually it is a neo-Hegelian argument. You're talking about the goal of history, not the the final, sort of like, okay, turn it off, but rather that the ideological battle in defense of liberal democracy is no longer a battle, and that had been won. And it's not about there will be no more history, but at least there's no more argument that totalitarianism is better, which was kind of the argument up till that point. And and so that was the wrong interpretation to take. But even that, the right interpretation, it's not quite clear, but I would say that has more to do with the mobilization that is possible under authoritarian regimes in a digital era, which is something that before could not work. But now, to think, let's put it this way, it's no longer simply a theoretical notion, but it's probably practical to have a planned and centrally controlled economy with big data analysis. Online, real-time, big data analysis. You don't get all of the screw-ups that you get under Soviet communism or Chinese communism in the old days. Now, that's not what I think we want to go to, but nonetheless, it can work efficiently, and that's what they're striving for, I believe. And if you think about, with all of the revelations about, say, what the big data or what the Silicon Valley companies are doing, there's a big difference. There's one crucial difference between the massive collection of your data by Facebook and others and what happens in China is that in the system that comes out of the U.S., there is no pipeline that goes to the government. And WeChat and Weibo and all those guys, they're doing the same stuff, maybe even better. But there is this pipeline that happens also to go to the government, which is then used. I said this a few days ago, and someone said, well, how do we know it's not going in the U.S.? I go, well, you're not seeing it instrumentalized in any way. No one's coming after you for saying that I don't like Donald Trump. So that's not happening. But in fact, those are two of the three models of our future. One is massive data collection for controlling society and massive data collection for creating outer space levels of a Gini coefficient on income inequality.
I think this idea of techno-totalitarianism is really interesting because optimistic believers in communism, and the worst some in the past, used to think that it was all a matter of technology. If you could just get the computers would make the planned economy work. That was their last great hope. And that obviously didn't work and could never work. But it may be that technology can make a Leninist political system work by constraining individual actions and giving the authorities a kind of 3D insight into everything you have done, are doing, and from implication, therefore, will likely to do. Which is which could actually work. It seems that it's hard to see how that would fall apart.
Well, I have an overdue essay that I have to write, which 60 years ago in Cambridge, 1959, May, C.P. Snow, who was a physical chemist and a literary novelist who coined the expression "the corridors of power," wrote an essay called "The Two Cultures." It was not a great essay, and it caused a minor stir because he was talking about, well, at Cambridge, you have the physicists and chemists talking to one another at one table at the college club or the college, and there's another table where the physicists, the poets and the novelists and Shakespeare scholars are drinking, and they said he was the only one who could walk between the tables and sit in either one. And he said, well, we have to get over this with the university. The problem is that was the problem of the university because technology did not impinge upon your life. The Orwellian television that looked at you didn't exist. Whereas now, Estonians laughed at me when 7 years ago I said, cover up the little camera on your computer. I don't know if they still laugh, but they thought it was really riotous that I should propose that. You didn't know. If you had everyone had a telephone, but if you walked out of the room because it was plugged in the wall, didn't know where you were. Whereas your where you are is known somewhere and at least accessible by, when you have your driving app, it's, there's traffic ahead. That's only because there are all these other people there that who are being monitored. So we live in a different era in which technology allows us to get into everyone's lives. And the problem we face in terms of the two cultures is exemplified either by the sophomoric platitudes uttered by the head of Facebook about whatever it is, but aside from saying we're sorry for the 14th time, and then there's the Senator Orrin Hatch who. From the government side, who asked Mark Zuckerberg, how do you make your money? So you have governments that had no idea about the world of minimal idea about technology, how it works, what it does. And then you have technologists who may boast that they left Harvard after a year and a half. And I would have said, well, maybe you should have stuck around and taken a few ethics courses.
Yeah. Well, that is a neat bridge into the next thing we want to look at, which has been touched on a bit at the conference, about why our threat perceptions in the sort of policy security community are not, to put it mildly, shared by much of the younger generation and indeed most of the population of Germany. And one of the things that people do care about is privacy. And particularly in Europe, and Germany has very strong privacy protections. We now have GDPR and so on. But if you need to get young people involved in questions of policy, obviously climate change and all that is one very good way in because they want to save the planet, and you can't do that without passing laws and doing stuff. But the other is the question of personal privacy, and people are both often very careless about the data they spray around, but they also quite mind the idea of being of micro-targeting and so on. So I'm wondering, Toomas, perhaps you could...
Which one?
You're Toomas.
The Estonian Toomas is pronounced identically to the way the German Toomas is pronounced.
I'm trying to find a difference. Bear with me.
That's what he found out.
In terms of getting German attention on this, do you see the sort of the if you like the privacy vector that we are the only governments, only united governments in the European context can stand up to big tech, protect your privacy, give you the legal and perhaps even the sort of normative framework you need to live your lives as a digital citizen. Is that a way forward? Is that something that has traction?
Well, let me start by picking up what Toomas said on the on the technology argument. I think I agree. When we're talking about the end of history, we never meant a cutoff. We meant what I call the assumption of gradual convergence, and we put the changes of technology and innovation into the same category. It was not only that China or Russia would gradually become like us, but technology would actually accelerate that process, and it would convince them that that was the only reasonable way to go. And it turns out that's not necessarily true for all the reasons you've just described. So that contributes to the disappointment, if you will, that technology might as well work the other way. And support a very different model of governance. But what I've been struck by is that we can all analyze how the world around us is changing tremendously. The foundations of German post-war foreign policy eroding, and the whole world around us is changing, and nowhere faster than in the technology realm. And all the technologists will remind us that nothing will be as it was. But funnily enough, when we talk about the future of democracy, we all believe that it should be static. We like it as it is. We want to protect it from any change. I find it far too defensive, far too static. I think in our own thinking, we should not only think about the future of democracy, but really also about the democracy of the future. Because it will, if we don't introduce a dynamic element into our thinking again, we will always be defensive. Defensive against those who use modern technology to bolster their authoritarian instincts or systems, but on the defensive also in our own societies, including against our own younger generation who grow up with this stuff. So that's number one. And when I go to Stanford, I'm struck by when they think about the democracy of the future, that they essentially think they can sort of technology and a version of direct democracy can do away with all institutions and all the cast of politicians.
This is the Stanford trope. Sorry.
Yeah. But it is also there, and I think that has its own problematic elements to it. So the real question then, when it comes to Europe, I think is sort of we have the whole regulatory question. What do we actually want to protect? What do we think is crucial to maintaining the basic functioning of our societies, but also the integrity of our political discourse? That has to do with foreign interference, but it also has to do with the business models of the big American tech companies. Of course it has. And that is something we can't do as Germany, we can't do as Estonia, we can do as a European Union. And we've proven that we're able to do that. Is that sufficient? No, it's not, because you need an innovative part as well. You need a technology base as well. I remember in one of the previous panels, someone asked, why is it that we don't have a European platform? Well, that's a good question. And the whole technology side, how do you keep Europe competitive in the digital age, I think is a major subject of discussion. But let me come to your other point about sort of a generation that grows up. So we have this power, we have the regulatory power of Europe. We can set our own standards. We have to define what our political systems, our political discourse should look like in terms of the technical parameters and in terms of the privacy of data. But we have a young generation that has other concepts, other ideas. So you mobilize them around Europe in what? In the opposition to the idea of an upload filter. That was it was a big debate in Germany when it came to the recent legislation in the European Parliament, because they feel that there's something taken away from the freedom that the internet offers of future business models or their way of collecting their own information. So it's not clear to me that this. You can mobilize this in a sort of in a single direction or for a unified purpose easily. But I think there clearly is a discussion to be had how you use the threat perception, if you will, that is there among parts of the society, that technological progress in the form of specific business models or in the form of specific geopolitically driven interventions and meddling is actually threatening the way we want to run our own societies and our own political systems.
Tom, you're dying to jump in. Go on.
Well, there's just a couple. First of all, privacy, or as you Brits call it, privacy, is indeed a fundamental concern in Europe. Several points on that. Number one, I think far worse or far more important and completely under-discussed is the notion of data integrity. Privacy is if someone publishes my blood type. Data integrity is someone changes the record of my blood type, which is worse. Right? Or think about bank accounts or whatever. You don't want when you live in an age when all of your data exists in digital form. The question is changing it. Not so much who's looking at it, but changing it. The EU, when I mentioned before, there was the American and the Chinese model. The EU actually is my third sort of direction that a digital society can take with far greater concern for the rights of the user than in either other place. And this may, in fact, lead to a sort of slower uptake of technology. On the other hand, I think that that's something that will happen in Europe simply because of concerns about things such as privacy. They are, the issues that confront Europe on a technological future, don't exist in those other societies, and I think we just have to say, okay, that's all right. Now, to talk about the Stanford view, I mean, there is no such thing, but I mean, this idea, this techno-optimism that, which is, we'll do away with institutions, have direct democracy, that it precisely is the product of the kind of thinking of people who have never, ever taken a poli-sci course, let alone a philosophy course. And in fact, I'm quite scared by talk about direct digital democracy because I can't think of a better way to manipulate elections than through digital processes. But what is very much a part of the sort of the Stanford or the whole Silicon Valley, I should say, mentality is that we will find a technical solution to this problem or that problem, be it fake news or be it something related. I suspect we have to really begin to address the fundamental vulnerabilities of democracy as it is practiced. More so in the Anglo-Saxon countries than in Europe, because in Europe we generally have multiple mandate election districts, and you have first past the post elections in the UK, Canada, the United States, which generally leads to a two-party system, and which leads to greater manipulation potential manipulation of election results in the digital era, as we have seen in 2016, both with the Brexit referendum and the election of the presidential election. When you have this is the thing about multiple mandate election districts, you end up with a bunch of parties, and then you have a coalition. What you do with that coalition is your own problem, but you can see in when the New York Times writes that the Swedish hard right won the election in Sweden when they got 20%. No, they didn't win. They just had a plurality, but the rest of the ones said, no, we're not letting them into government. Well, this is, of course, you can come to this country and then, no, they didn't win the election, but instead the government itself formed a coalition like this. So you can still end up with those kind of results, but at least in terms of electoral manipulation with a multiple mandate election district, it's hard to do. So what I'm saying is that we have to look at what do we do to protect democracy. One of the things to do is to look at your electoral system, because in the digital era they become very vulnerable in certain cases, also in the case of referenda, I would argue.
Yes, I think it's certainly true that technology has accentuated the problems and created new ones. But the thing that really strikes me about this is that I remember the 80s, and there was a feeling back in the 80s that the Western democratic system based on mass political parties, one vote every 5 years, different tiers of government, local, national, and so on, that this was already fraying quite badly. It was something that we'd inherited from a previous generation. We defended it strongly during the Cold War. But I think if you'd polled people in the mid-80s, they'd have said that there's definitely time to look at this, because it's bleeding. It's vulnerable to money. People don't belong to political parties anymore. So the idea that I don't know. Hands up anyone here who is a member of a political party. Yeah, so I should put my hand up, sorry, I'm Lib Dem. That's like 4 people in the entire room. I think if we'd had this conference a few years ago, it might have been more. So I think what Toomas Baga was saying about defence of, it's not enough just to think about the future of democracy, but the democracy of the future. I'm slightly disappointed that when the wall came down, that these extremely dynamic, innovative countries like Estonia, which has given us, among other things, e-government, didn't give us e-democracy. that we are still basically practicing the same sort of politics here, with results that we'll get onto in a moment, that have been practiced not terribly successfully in the rest of Europe for many decades. Do you think there's some room for improvement or innovation here?
As a techno-optimist, I have a very dystopian view of direct democracy via digital means. I think that, yes, voting on the internet is fine, but the kind of manipulation that you're subject to if you start having sort of voluntary participation in sort of pseudo-referenda on every single issue, as some people have proposed, will lead to the greatest influx of influencers that you can imagine, and is doomed to failure. So I'm not sure. In fact, if we're going to talk about sort of reforming democracy and democracy of the future, I think we have to rethink even the concept of a referendum, because referenda are basically pointless unless you have kind of like near 50-50 results. I mean, why would you have a referendum if you know that 85% are for something? But you're going to have a referendum on something controversial. But that is precisely...
Can I just say, coming from a country that we had a 50-50 result, I don't really recommend it.
No, I'm saying... that's precisely what I'm talking about, is that especially what is now coming out about manipulation with Aaron Banks and with Cambridge Analytica and various things, that precisely where you have where you have a close binary decision, that is where the manipulation can come in, and that is, I think, therefore, we should limit even the concept of referenda, given how vulnerable they are to external foreign manipulation, as well as internal domination.
Yeah, so the ancient Greeks, we all, kleptocracy was much talked about, and we've had various other democracy, but the ancient Greeks were also very worried that democracy would turn into what they called ochlocracy, mob rule. Yeah. And I feel that this direct, instant participation by the most enthusiastic people having the greatest voice opens the door to that. Toomas, you raised this idea of the democracy of the future. Do you want to just give us a couple of pointers about how you think what it might look like?
Well, in the last panel on China, I think it was Bobo who asked the question to the panelists, isn't the China debate really also about us, or maybe primarily about us? The lies we tell ourselves, the standards we preach to others. And I've come to this conference in earlier years when I was still doing policy planning in the foreign ministry. And in those years, of course, this conference was about foreign policy discussions, was about geopolitical discussions. And I remember that, certainly 2014, 2015, with Crimea, the Donbass and everything, but also the authoritarian turn in China, this was the pressure on the liberal order of sort of the rising powers that were destroying or at least challenging the foundations on which we had built our own peace and prosperity. And I didn't read C.P. Snow, but I have my own 1959 book, which is Kenneth Waltz's Man, the State and War, which I had to read in my first international relations class in the United States. And his basic argument was, the level that really explains the question of war and peace is the systemic level. That's sort of classic Cold War theory. And I find myself now going back and rereading it and saying, well, what does he actually have to say about the state and about man? So about the level of our own societies and about the level of the individual. Because I think that is where the challenge now comes from, certainly since 2016, since the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump. But you have it elsewhere. You have Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, and who is wildly popular. You have Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. So there's stuff happening in societies that we don't quite understand. But we better look for the reasons.
So what's the book called again? The book you quoted?
Man, the State and War. Oh, it's the three levels of analysis. I mean, what drives conflicts? Is it the individual? Is it societies? Or is it the systemic level that... and in the Cold War, he had a very convincing argument as a neo-realist to say it's the Well, not convincing, but he had an argument. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is, I find myself now going to these conferences because I'm a foreign policy type myself. And I'm somewhat uneasy because the discussions necessarily lead into stuff that we were not used to discuss 5 years ago or 10 years ago, namely about what is happening in our own societies. Are these questions of credibilities of our economic model after the financial crisis of 2008-9? Everyone believed we knew what we were doing, and it turns out we didn't, or at least the bankers didn't. Are these questions of rising inequality that we had overlooked? Are these questions of cultural insecurity? So it comes to all of the migration question, and what does that do to people? Are they simply reacting to to levels of complexity that they're no longer able to deal with? And then you go down to the level of the individual and you say, why do the politics of resentment and fear are actually so attractive today?
Yeah.
Why is that? And I think we have to look at all of these in order to understand what is happening to our democracies and why we have lost the that sense of Zuversicht, or a compelling vision of why our future will be better than our past.
I'll bring it to foreign policy and security policy right now. The vote to bring Russia back to the Council of Europe, which was heavily pushed, by the way, by Mr. Maas, I think represents the death of that organization as the sole normative human rights organization where violations of the most extreme sort are condoned by bringing them back in. And I would suggest countries leave the Council of Europe, because what's the point? What is the point of the Council of Europe as the sole normative human rights organization that is not based on, like the OSCE, on getting consensus? Why don't we just say, okay, nice, it didn't work, it has completely failed, having ejected Russia for violating all of even those rules adopted via consensus, including the UN Charter of Rights, the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Accords. All of that were violated, not to mention all the violations of human rights going on with the Crimeans. And we say, oh, that's okay. It's better to have them in the tent than out, which is an argument we hear also in a different context. But the point is, I don't think that organization has no raison d'etre at this point. So I would suggest leave. Let us all say, fine, bye, it didn't work.
Well, let me just beg to differ, because we also need some disagreement here. But I've heard this basically this tone also yesterday here in this room, yesterday evening, that if only we could get Russia out of our system, we would all be fine. The kind of argument I've just tried to make before, that we have problems in our own society and at the level of very personal urges, instincts, and desires, suggests to me that this isn't a problem we need to deal with, admittedly. But it's not the answer to all our problems and to all our challenges.
But we're not invading anybody.
I would say it is the smaller part of it. And when I argue, in my own, based on the article that you started off with, I argue for more realism and more pragmatism in German foreign policy. And I have plenty of people in my own community who would accuse me of promoting a cynical version of realism that wants to do away with normative standards. I have a very different idea. I think what we need, when I talk about more realism in German foreign policy, I want more humility, in the sense that we are more aware of the limits of our own abilities to transform others. And I want more curiosity. I don't want sort of the mindset of a winner who believes that now, because he's on the right side of history and everyone else will inevitably become like him, there's no need to actually care about or try to understand what makes others tick, but really look at the individual countries, because each and every one is different in its own right. And I found that the panel yesterday afternoon on the question of is there a new and next generation in Russia was one of the most interesting that I could listen to, exactly because it tried to understand what is going on within Russian society and not saying in an essentialist way, Russia is what it always has been, why would it even be worth listening to a Russian?
Well,
Briefly, Thomas.
briefly, I think we have to be in a far more defensive mode. That the organizations that we cherish the most, NATO and the European Union, have not effectively dealt with these new threats. Instead, EU comes out with PESCO, right? I mean, like, we already have NATO, but there is no one dealing with the threats to democracy except for NGOs and academics dealing with the threats to democracy through external and also domestic manipulation of our media. It doesn't exist, because even the ones that do officially exist, the NATO Centers for Strategic Communication and for cyber, they can only deal with the O in NATO. If there's an attack on the NATO organization, you will get a report. But if there is an attack on an ally, member of the alliance, they do lack the mandate to address that. Only if it's an attack on NATO as an organization. And the EU has fallen down miserably on the kind of attention that needs to be paid to the threats to democracy via new media. And so I think we need to take a more defensive attitude. And I frankly think this is why, the collapse of the normative system, and let's just bring them in because we can talk to them, we have the OSCE for that. We have all kinds of things for that. The COE is not a place to have kumbaya sessions. It's, do you follow the rule of law as we have agreed to or not? And if you don't, then you don't have a place. All right. Keep the COE. My point is that we have to get our organizations, the ones based on liberal democracy, fundamental principles, to actually take a stronger defensive stance on preserving our institutions from attacks that are coming at us from lots of places.
I like the way the trajectory's gone from high theory to sharp practice. Let's talk about the events of the last 24 hours in Austria and what that tells us about dealing with populism. Because I very much appreciate Thomas's point that we used to talk about threats from outside, now it's threats from inside. Some of them are the result of malevolent foreign actors, some of them are the result of our own people being upset with the way the system is run. But we've now seen different ways of dealing with this. You have freeze them out in the cold, which is the kind of the Swedish model, also the German model. Don't allow them to elect a vice chair of the Bundestag, treat them as kind of political lepers. We've also seen what you might call the hug 'em close model, which is Finland, Austria, and now lately Estonia. The hope is you civilise them, maybe expose their internal contradictions, maybe they'll blow up or whatever. We've seen in Austria that the people you're hugging close turn out to be, at least it appears from this video, corrupt, treasonous, and deeply incompetent. Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
I would just
Toomas.
say, I think it shows the importance of journalism to keep democracy honest, and that if it, I don't know what the Presse was doing, but basically it was Süddeutsche Zeitung and Spiegel, which are neither one of which is Austrian, by the way, but they did this, and that's what you need in order to deal with the corruption that kind of almost inevitably follows authoritarian-minded rule and parties. There's such a high correlation between self-enrichment via illegal means and this tendency toward authoritarianism. And thank God that you have the Süddeutsche Zeitung and Spiegel, though I was never a fan of the latter.
It is, I mean, it's obviously very strong defence in the public interest. I have a slightly nervous worry. I'd love to know which government or high-end organisation that knows it was able to do such extremely expert bugging. I feel if I'd gone to The Economist when I worked there and said, I would like some money to bug a villa, and we're going to get this person to pretend to be a niece of a Russian oligarch, and then we're going to video all these corrupt politicians doing terrible things, and then we'll have a wonderful story at the end of it. I suspect my editors at The Economist might have thought there was a flaw in this plan. But Toomas, what's your lesson from Austria?
Well, I don't know that we know all the details of the story yet, but off the cuff, I would doubt that the original recording was done by anyone with sort of affiliated with the Süddeutsche Zeitung or the Spiegel. Yeah. So this is what Toomas is referring to is, of course, now making it public and visible to everyone. I mean, don't forget this is 2 years old, right? These conversations. But on in general, I totally agree. I think when we talk about the integrity of our political systems and the future of democracy, I think the role of independent journalism and media is a major, major element of that, because that is what we always thought was the built-in way, not just to have public discourse in a democracy to bring out the best solution, but then also to have what is absolutely critically necessary, which is an informed general public. I mean, that's the other book I owe to my American college education is Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But it goes to great length to talk about the need for education in democracies. And that is part of what we, I think, in many places have not paid enough attention to. But media is a critical component of that. On your initial question, so what is the better way, what is the more promising way of bringing them in and sort of exposing their flaws and weaknesses, or the oversimplicity of their answers to, in reality, complex problems, or to freeze them out in order to prevent bad things from happening? I don't have an answer, and if I had, it probably wouldn't be my role to give it here. But I think, we'll see what the result will be in Austria, whether people will feel that their idols have been set up. And that just shows how the establishment deals with outsiders, or whether their numbers in the new elections in Austria will be severely reduced, and the bet of Sebastian Kurz may materialize, who said, I would go out and try to govern on my own and go for as much of a majority as I can get. I don't have an answer to that, but I think the problem at the heart of it is, again, there's a social level problem. Why are these very simplistic answers to the complex problems of today so attractive? And then there's a very personal level, and that goes to the sort of the character flaws and other things that Toomas has talked about and that have been exposed yesterday.
It's one of Chrystia Freeland's, my former economist colleague, now working in another job in Canada, is that she says one of the only way you can really do strong foreign policy is if you have a high level of trust at home, and if people feel that the domestic side is working properly and they trust their leaders, then they'll accept some hits when it comes to trade spats and rows with other countries. It'd be interesting to see if the Canadian voters agree with her. But I want to come to to take some questions from the floor here, and I see the President. Is that your hand going out, Kirsty? Yes, very good. Be very I think you uniquely do not need to identify yourself. Everybody who is not President of Estonia, when I come to you, please explain. Please just identify yourself. The microphone for President, please.
Thank you. I wanted to slightly oppose to the notion that in order to talk and listen to our eastern neighbor, Russia, we have to formally return Russia behind the tables where we have pushed them off because they do not abide by the international law or their own promises. I, for one, believe in talking and listening, and I have proof for that. On the other hand, if we now give Russian the equation that after Georgia it was 3 months, after Ukraine it was 5 years, then we have given them the foolproof recipe for the future. West drops everything, we bite quickly and never picks it up again. But that's not a question, that's a comment. The other one is maybe more like a question. Your panelist's name, Thinking Cannot Be a Campaign, which I think is stating the obvious. I mean, if you think of the past campaigns of election, wherever, thinking is not part of it. In Estonia, one of the best debates before the elections was ran between one social democrat and somebody from E200. Voters did not actually reward them. One got 0 seats, the other less than ever. So thinking cannot be a campaign, this is true. But what can we really do then to get at least thinking back into our campaigns, or at least pose our campaign still on the thinking, not on the loud noises, which of course we can effectively all create, both sides. So to the extent that in order to get your message through, our own media managers advise us to troll the most important national symbols, like, for example, inaugurations of governments.
Thank you very much. There's James Sher over there. We shall take some questions together. Can we have the microphone to James Sher, please?
I've introduced myself far too much, so forgive me, Edward. I am less disturbed by the fact that the mainstream German threat assessment of Russia differs from mine than I am by the fact that the mainstream German assessment of Edward Snowden differs from mine. And I multiply that, it is not a uniquely German phenomenon, because the same thing is true in British and American universities. But here's my question I'd like you to reflect upon, because I don't have an answer. How did freedom of information become a fundamental right? You cannot find reference to it in any fundamental document about human rights. There is freedom of speech, there is freedom of religion, there is freedom of association. I don't know where you will find freedom of information.
The Helsinki Final Act. Helsinki Final Act.
It's actually there?
Yes.
Well,
it is the Radio Free Europe
You've depressed me profoundly, but you have answered. You have answered my question. Thank you.
Pass the microphone on to Matt Breiser. This is speedy service at the end of the conference.
That's impressive. In a way, I'm sort of picking up on that point. I'm Matt Breiser from the Atlantic Council. As we imagine the future of democracy in its form, can we talk about maybe our imagination of the future of social media? Because I think that the business model of social media is what's partially, maybe largely responsible for atomization and for the politics of hate and division being so popular, because we're fed algorithmically, right, the information we want to receive in our little group, and we break down. So Silicon Valley conventional wisdom is there should be no serious regulation of internet freedom. How is it possible to regulate social media that eliminates this problem? Thanks.
Excellent. And then finally, Andrei Michta, just pass the microphone along. So I'm now introducing everybody, but
thank you. Thank you, Edward. Andrew Michta, the Marshall Center. I want to address something that Toomas said, because as I was listening to this debate, and we get fascinated with social media and direct democracy, Stanford, the latest. So here are a couple of data points based on about 27 years of my experience in colleges, universities, JPME. We stopped teaching civics in the US public schools in about 1970, 71. I would repeatedly have students who would come into my intro to IR poli-sci courses with only a very vague notion of what the foundation documents are. Some of them never read the Federalist Papers, the kind of things that we used to take as a foundation of citizenship. When I looked at the curricula evolve in American colleges, they have moved further away from what I would consider the fundamental education of a citizen, knowing your foundational documents, knowing your processes, knowing your tradition. I don't have an answer to this, but I would ask a question, because I don't know the European system in that respect, and you can maybe address that. But I think the deficits that we may be seeing and being subject to the manipulation and to all sorts of digital experiments at our expense has a lot to do that the very idea of citizenship in our democratic system is now, if not completely kind of flushed out from what it used to be, but it's clearly in flux. and the notion of what needs to be brought into that debate so that you have a sense of reciprocity between the elite and the citizenry, so that, leadership, the right to lead comes with obligation to serve. And a lot of the discussions that I see now, the end of history, not the end of history, and why we get the reactions from the public that we actually get these days, I think it's a question of degree. It is not an all-out rebellion, in my view, in my humble opinion, having spent some time in Rhode Island before I came here to Germany on my third tour. Rhode Island is an almost entirely deindustrialized state. And so the notion that the people who live there, what they experience on a daily basis vis-a-vis what they see in the narrative about globalization and the larger economic benefits and political benefits, that has to be somehow bridged. And I wonder if we have not reached the point when we talked about globalization before this populist rebellion started taking hold, that we almost became Trotskyites post-1990 in reverse. We unlocked history, we knew how it was going to end, and rather than having a very keen sense of the balance between what is politically possible and what really seemed efficient, we kind of went overboard. Sorry, too long.
It was future questions will be shorter.
Promise.
Tom, any thoughts to any of those?
No argument.
To any of it?
I already answered OSCE, CSE, Helsinki Final Act.
Do you want to respond to your successor's question?
I thought that was more for Toomas.
Okay. Just being polite. Putting thinking back in the campaign is a great slogan, and maybe we should have if I could write it up, I'd write it up.
I don't disagree. Unfortunately, having looked at Estonian politics, the IQ level there was kind of shoe size. The only question was whether we are dealing with European or American.
On that note, I do think. Yes. For those of you who don't know, the Anglo-Saxon shoe sizes go from sort of 1 to 14. But I must say, I do think it's a pity. I feel we are talking. We talk about Russia and China. We have had Russians and Chinese in the room. I feel it's a pity we haven't had anyone from ECRE here. I would have loved to have had a side meeting where this is probably the most informed and sympathetic audience for Estonia in the world. Yeah, but I just think it would be interesting to put their most articulate and controversial people up in front of a audience like this, and we would fire questions at them, and we would draw conclusions from the result.
Let me actually just sort of say something about what the president said. It was that basically I think we have to think on two tiers, and more broadly than we already do. There is nothing against having dialogue with Russia. That's fine, but you have a club of shared values, and that's contingent upon meeting certain fundamental things, such as freedom of speech and non-invasion of your neighbors. And that club is our club, and you don't get to be in there. You want to talk? Yeah, we have all these other places to talk, but there are places that need to be ours. Mm-hmm.
Thomas, there are plenty of questions there. Would you like to respond to some?
Yeah, they're not easy. I do work for a president who's never believed in the concept of talking to people as a matter of punishment or reward. And because I've had the pleasure of having my article quoted here a number of times, let me quote something else that Kadri just published on. I don't believe that we're really running the risk of returning to what some call business as usual with Russia. There will be no business as usual. The relationship will be different. It is different, and it will remain different than what it was. And talking to them does not change that. And it's not necessarily a slippery slope that you could then you must worry about sanctions regimes and other things. That is just a position or a worry that I do not share. And to Toomas, yes, I think it is that is a legitimate argument. But you could also say our club is the European Union. And there are plenty of people in Russia who have an interest in having Russia stay in the Council of Europe, not because it is a kumbaya club, but because there is a European Court of Human Rights that issues verdicts and judgments that actually do affect what happens in Russia and how they look at their own system. So, you can disagree with that, but I think it is. I'm always worried by these categories of moral clarity when we try to apply them to the outside world. Let us try to apply them to within the European Union, and we have enough problems with that.
But we're not invading anyone inside the Union.
I think our Ukrainian and Georgian friends might question the idea that our club is the European Union. At least it's not theirs yet. But I think that's Lolita Sigani at the back, is it?
Yeah.
And then Ian Bond right next to her. Go ahead. But behind you, please turn around. Lady with the microphone. Behind you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for noticing us here at the far back. I actually want to second the idea.
Sorry, this is Lolita.
My name is Lolita Sigani. I'm a politician from Latvia. I wanted to second the idea that was just expressed by Mr. Becker. Council of Europe is really a very important organization. It is just the fact that because of so many different formats that have become so much more fashionable, we have stopped engaging with this organization. I have myself been a member of the Latvian delegation to the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, and I have seen how the level of participation from participating states has dropped. So we do have to strengthen this organization because of the very fact that it does run the European Court of Human Rights that is so important for many civil society and human rights activists in the participating states. Thank you.
Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform.
There you are, you've introduced me. Yes, just to follow up on what Lolita was saying. Turkey's membership of the Council of Europe continues despite the fact that Turkey has been through several military coups since it was first admitted in 1949 and has invaded one of its neighbours, namely Cyprus, and remains in occupation of the northern part of Cyprus. The European Court, I think, is a very important thing that we shouldn't throw away. I also think, given my own country's stance, that I worry that what we are doing is unravelling something that others will then follow in unravelling and reducing the human rights protections available to their citizens. I did have a question for
Good.
Toomas, if I may.
Which Thomas?
Sorry, Toomas Bagger, excuse me. Well, I wouldn't call Toomas Hendrik Ilves, I mean, I probably call him Mr. President, but there we are. Toomas, I liked your phrase about the democracy of the future, not the future of democracy. But when you talked about journalism and the free media, you talked about it, I thought, in rather more conservative terms, in a sense. I mean, the arrival of social media is having a dramatic effect on the traditional media, on the profession of journalism and so on. Do you have any thoughts on how you get from where we are now to a journalism of the future that matches your democracy of the future?
Thanks very much. I'll turn to you first, then I have a short question for Toomas, and then we'll, I think, be winding up. So I apologise to those who I didn't have a chance to call.
You didn't take anyone from that side of the room, though.
Were there any? I didn't see any hands on it, sir. Was there very?
There's one in the back.
Yes, no, I'm going to be firm here. Sorry, I'm in charge. I also have a plane to catch. Toomas.
Yeah, Ian's question, but it echoes what Matt, I think, has asked as well. And sort of, is there a way of regulating or framing social media and that helps to protect or channel political discourse in a way that actually enables compromise, open discussion, looking for the best possible solutions? I have to admit, I don't have the answer. It's an issue my president talks about a lot because it is something we observe also in the German political discourse. In many ways, what Andrew said on civic education, and partly also because of our very particular history that has always been strong, I think stronger than in many other countries across the continent. It remains strong, but it doesn't make us immune. So we have the same sort of phenomena of anti-establishment, sort of anger and resentment that can actually has it much easier to organize via social media. And it's not by accident that in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland is, in all studies that I have seen, is the most social media affine party and the strongest party on social media, using it as an alternative to established media, or die Lügenpresse.
That's a universal. That's a universal, almost all everywhere.
It is. But in that respect, I think that is a critical component of what we need to address. But I also think that, in a way, I as a father of three, I don't believe that the younger generation is less political, less politically interested, less politically active. But these are other issues, other means of consuming information, but also other ways of sort of coalescing around certain issues. Where you take climate change, you take plastic garbage in the seas. It's no longer NATO's double-track decision and Russia and Soviet SS-20s as it was in my days. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is sort of a non-political generation that emerges. And I think, again, I think on the regulation of the big platforms, it's for politics to reassert itself. I mean, what gives us this idea, other than that Amazon and Facebook and Google tell us that they are beyond regulation and beyond the nation state, to actually prove them wrong on that?
So you're either going to be told what to do and to think by Facebook or by the Chinese Communist Party. Toomas, final word to you. You are an ex-journalist before you went into politics, and I always worry, as a sort of journalist myself, this idea that we can rely on the traditional media and it seems to me that the business model has been upended by technology and economic change, and we need to think very deeply about how we're going to have the information flows we need for democracy to work, particularly in smaller and poorer countries. In big countries and in big languages, you can get critical mass. You can have high-quality journalism in English, German, French, theoretically Chinese, we can only pray, but much harder to do it in countries of a million or 2 million.
What's the question?
I just wondered what you thought. I mean, you respond either to that or to anything else, but there were a couple of questions about social media and whether that should be regulating.
Well, I mean, what you are up against is that, I mean, if you have, in small countries, getting quality journalism is tougher, especially because the bottom line is all that matters, and there are far fewer opportunities to have, a sort of the quality journalism of having The Atlantic or having the British Spectator. You don't have that. Because there's just not a large enough an audience or a public that would fund it or that could keep it going. Yes, that is a problem. I think that a far bigger problem are the bubbles that are created. See, if you were like a neo-Nazi in the past, unless you were living in Illinois, you wouldn't know any other Nazis. No, that's just a reference to an American movie. But anyway, Illinois Nazis is a begriff or a concept. But anyway, you wouldn't know any other ones, right? You could sit in your basement, your mother's basement, and be a Nazi. But the problem is that now you can find all the other basement-sitting Nazis on Facebook, because you have your basement-sitting Nazi group. What is worse is that you can monetize this, because if you want to sell something on Facebook, you can say, I want people who are this, and this. And in 2017, after the election, there were actually journalists who went and said, we want to find Nazis, and they got hate Jews and and think black people are inferior, and they ended up getting a whole bunch of people who fit this group and who fit that profile based on their Facebook information, and postings, and you could advertise to them. So if you want to sell them Nazi regalia, you've got the audience. Now, this is the power of social media these days that far exceeds the ability of a quality newspaper to affect people, because people are self-selecting their media input. And you have this media input, and this is a problem that I don't know how we're going to face. And I'm saying we have to make corrections rather in the way we do elections, maybe, than we don't want to censor. We don't like hate speech, but I mean, if you want to be a Nazi, I mean, be a Nazi, right? You wouldn't find them elsewhere. Now you do.
Well, I'm slightly troubled that both our panelists, as their final words, have featured the words "I don't know." But then Toomas did say we need more humility, so that's probably quite a good thing. I have several takeaways. One is I urgently need to find a philologist specialising in phonetics who will tell me whether there is any way you can pronounce the Estonian Toomas and the German Toomas differently. I also feel that the conference organisers might want to consider in future having a reading list which would go out after the conference, which would list all the things. I strongly commend Peter Mattis's testimony to Congress. I will read Stephen Walsh, as he suggested. CP Snow already haven't, and that's just an aside. But my most important task now is to hand over to Eva, who is going to close the conference. I think we all know you, Eva, but if we don't, Eva is the person who deserves all the praise. And if there were any blame, it would go to you, but there isn't.